Okay, so introduction to migrating to web components. We're talking about migrating them as replacements for our portlets. So here's our agenda for this hour. I've got a lot of information packed in this presentation, so it might bleed over into the afternoon session. So I'll try to make sure I get most of it recorded here, and if we go over, I'll do a subsequent recording and kind of stitch them together so that there's at least some video out there that covers the whole thing. But fingers crossed we'll get through it without skipping too much. So we'll talk about this session and the next one, web component basics, quick overview of web components in general. Servlet RESTful API is kind of what they mean, what they look like, the support that's out there. We're going to talk about a strategy for converting our portlets to web components, some of the things to take into consideration, and then given time, and this is probably what we'll roll into this afternoon, and that is we'll look at the notifications portlet as our example because it had two major refactors over the last few years. One, it switched from Maven to Gradle. It's our only portlet that is using Gradle as the build tool. But further, it was split into kind of a hybrid. You could set up notifications, and you still can for today, as of today, use notifications as a portlet and the old interfaces. But there have been servlets created to build out this RESTful API, and there is a sister project with notification web components, and that's how uPortal is currently configured, is to use these notification web components and the backend. So we'll take a look at that. It was written, converted a couple of years ago, so it might not have the best practices in place, but we'll poke and prod and see what we come up with. So introduction, this session's really, again, talking about the background of what you need to know when considering doing the web components. I was really hoping to get in and have us work on building out either front end or back end replacements for a particular portlet, but that's actually a pretty big lift, and you'll see as we dig into this session. But we certainly can talk about what planning looks like, get a couple of plans documented out there, and hopefully find some folks that are willing to execute on those plans. The afternoon session was to review the active uPortal portlets. I found a lot of uPortal portlets that we didn't know we necessarily had. I'll show you that list if we have time. Certainly we'll cover that in the afternoon. And then we're going to brainstorm particular portlets and what we need to do there. However, we've had some great conversations at the conference yesterday and this morning, and we may end up changing the afternoon session instead of just this brainstorming and documentation on what it would take to replace the rendering pipeline so that we really don't have portlets, and how we could directly have web components inside of pages and have a UI admin integration that lets us do things dynamically and just have kind of web components, right? Different types of layouts. So we'll let you know how that goes. All right. Any questions so far? I'm wearing a headset. I probably shouldn't because I can't hear you guys if you're talking. These are really good at drowning out background noise. So web components are really the first feasible replacements for portlets. That probably is a quote from one of the earlier uPortal developers. So portlets really were a great way to isolate content on a page. You don't necessarily know what's going in, very structured on information that would be passed to the portlets, and we'd take whatever was going to be rendered and brought it back out, well documented. And it's really about the isolation that it supported is why it made portals and portlet technology so feasible. And there's been some efforts to kind of replace that, but web components really does bring in the isolation that we need and the composability. And so those are the two really important things that allow us to not seriously talk about replacing all the portlets, because you can create a web component. What it looks like in HTML is a custom tag, and you can move that around the page. So that's the exciting news. So I'm going to explain what web components are for those of you who don't know. There's no official web component specification. What it is JavaScript that implements a couple of these standards by the W3C body. So there's templates, and I'll show you all of these, but there's templates that allow you to create HTML that isn't going to be rendered on the page until you do something to put it on the page. Custom elements, which is probably the most visible way to say, oh yeah, that's probably a web component. It just allows you to name your own HTML tag. The Shadow DOM gives you isolation so that you don't have JavaScript colliding with other JavaScript. That's been a big hurdle with uPortal in the past. With Shadow DOM, your styling and JavaScript all get isolated away from the page unless you go through pains to kind of drill down into it, for analytics. That would be the best example. Why you would, pierce that division. And then ES modules allows you to create bigger JavaScript chunks of code and import them into uh, your page in isolation. So it's similar to the Shadow DOM. It's really 100% modern. We have support across all the major browsers for these technologies. Now it's 2023, so we really feel much more confident about moving forward as opposed to 2018 when there was a bunch of ways we had to patch the browsers to get some of this functionality. So we're in a really good place. So template is a name of an element. You can put this in an HTML document, and when the browser sees it, it says, yep, someone's created a template. I'm going to ignore everything inside of that and mosey on along. We used to do something like this where we would create a div and set it so that its display was hidden. It would still get rendered on the page. You just couldn't see it. Well, technically. We don't care whether it got rendered or not. It just wasn't part of the page or visible to the user. So now there's this actual tag that says, hey, inside of this is something, some HTML, don't render it on the page. I'll go ahead and do it dynamically. And that's what the bottom couple lines of JavaScript do. It goes ahead and grabs the template with the ID greeting, and then it clones that, basically making a copy of the contents of that template or that H2 block. And then actually, this could be corrected. And then it makes a change to it and then actually drops it inside of the body. So that's how templates work. Custom elements, as you could probably guess, it is your own custom tag name. Ooh. So this example is alert message. There's no HTML tag called alert message. It is a custom tag that you have to define often in this class. So you can see in the JavaScript, we're extending an HTML element, class is alert message. This doesn't create the custom element. It is the lines down here, custom elements dot define, and it's mapping the custom tag name to a JavaScript class, right? And you can play with things like grab the attribute values. This is a great way to pass information into it, make it configurable, and even do some kind of dropping in HTML that could be then processed by the class and used during the rendering. But just because this paragraph is inside of alert message doesn't mean it's going to get rendered. Bless you. All right, and the Shadow DOM, really it's the Shadow DOM and ES modules that really help us to isolate JavaScript because you don't know what's going to end up on the page in something like a portal. So you really have to have this isolation to prevent code from walking on each other's toes, right? Implementations. If back in the day it was jQuery, we're always kind of walking on you'd import a certain version of jQuery and another author of another portlet would import something else that was a version or two off, or there was a lot of name collision, I guess is the best way to say it. So with Shadow DOM, what happens, and this is a feature you can turn on and off, it allows you to anything defined inside of um, your web component can be isolated so that you have your own styling, your own JavaScript, your own templates, and nobody else sees them. So you can go ahead and reuse the name like greeting in your web component, and it's being isolated versus someone else is using the exact same ID. Because IDs are supposed to be unique across a page. When you're getting content from desperate sources, you just can't guarantee that. Okay. And again, there are ways to pierce that if you need to, but it's going to be an explicit effort to go ahead and reach into a shadow DOM. Then ES modules allows you to bring in JavaScript as a module, and you explicitly declare what names are going to be exported out of the module. And when you're using a module, you explicitly say what you're going to bring in from that module to use. So another layer of isolation. It's really the big benefit for us. Does that sound right? I'm not a JavaScript developer. I just play one on TV. There is some great information on how to create a view-based web component from scratch. This was developed from uPortal Dev Days I want to say 2019. We group of us had started building out the documentation, and because we had about 15 participants walk through it, a bunch of little corner cases came to the surface, and one of the attendees took the evening and just wrote up a great document, refined what we had started with, refined it, added appendices to it. It really was a great group effort, and one of the best things I've seen come out of an event like this, Dev Days. So here's the link. You can go to that repo. There's the path, and there's full documentation on what you need to install, how to create a Vue web component repo. We'll set up the tooling, not just to create the front end piece, but also how to wrap it in a jar and bring it into uPortal. Okay. So it's kind of when I was working on this slide that I realized just that effort was over a half a day of work. So getting someone ramped up who hasn't worked on web components is well beyond a 2-hour workshop. All right. Any questions about web components? You guys are now all web component experts, right? Yep. Okay, cool. Oh, did you need me to go over anything? Okay, we're good. All right. All right. So, servlets and APIs. Um, Starting with the basics, HTTP has a handful of verbs, right? Get and post are the two most common. Get is usually associated with clicking on a link on a web page, and post is when you fill out a form, click the button to send it or post it. There's also put, patch, and delete, not often used just on a basic web page, but they're defined and they become very useful for APIs. Just since most people aren't familiar with it, in particular, put and patch are a little different, and kind of the semantics there is put will replace an entire record. The idea being that any field that's not supplied is just going to be null or empty. Patch lets you just say, okay, I don't care. You could keep all the other values for all the other fields, but here's a set of fields with new values. So what's an API? The application programming interface. That's really general. Usually when we talk about APIs, we're talking about web APIs a lot of times. That's the context we're usually discussing them in. And then the idea of RESTful APIs get tossed around as well. And the distinction there is it's kind of like 3 levels. So there's this very general API. There's resource APIs, and that's where you start thinking about things like I want to do a shopping cart. So I'm going to have the cart itself, items inside the cart. So the idea of the resource, it's going to be the shopping cart and the items that you're going to purchase, those kinds of things, or some examples, a car, and the values might be make and model, but the resource is the car. So there's going to be these CRUD operations, to read it, create it, update the car, and potentially delete it, records around that. So that's a resource API. And when most folks define a RESTful or talk about RESTful APIs, they're really talking about a resource API. To get into the details of REST, it stands for representational state transfer, and there's some definitions and standards around that, and really the big difference that shakes out is that there should be links to a RESTful API such that you can start at the root, and that's all you need to know, and you'll get enough information on every response that has links to the areas within the API, and then what you can do once you're there. And you'll see some examples. All right, so REST APIs, client server architecture, stateless communication. In other words, there's no session information. You can update a record, you can grab a record, but the backend doesn't know that you're interacting with it and you've done a series of steps to accomplish some kind of workflow or path. All it knows is the last call you make or the current request you're making. Cacheable is another attribute of this. So kind of like on the reads, of course, the information changes. That's a cache problem, but a lot of this can be cacheable. Resources, for example, a specific car, if we're talking about that car example, would have an identification separate from representation. What that really means is there's a known URL that's usually easy to guess, but it has nothing to do with the JSON or XML you'll receive that represents that car. And then you should get for a real, and this is where we start getting the differences between a resource API and a REST API, and that is the responses will give you enough information so you know what you should be doing with that or can do with that and how to move forward or link out. And that's kind of the next item too, is kind of follow the hyperlinks to see other activity, maybe other cars or other parts of the API. All right, so that's the high level stuff. That's stuff you'd read in a blog post. So what does code really look like around REST controllers? If you're familiar with portlet controllers and general servlet controllers, with Spring, you'll see a lot of these classes already defined, and this will look very similar. So there's your mappings of those HTTP verbs, right? Along with request body and the higher level REST controller. There's a lot of support already there. So what takes it to the next level of a REST controller? Even though it's called a REST controller, you can implement a resource controller, and that's fine. But you need to bring in kind of this, how do you want to pronounce that? I don't know. Hetios? This is essentially a support package that will make it easy to create all the additional links you need to make it more of a REST API. Do we even need to do this? We don't need to do this, but I wanted to be complete and make sure we covered this aspect of REST API so that way you can dazzle your friends at parties. And that's it. Oh, I didn't even have an example. Sorry. All right, so that's the meat of it. How are we doing on time? Great. So about half the session. So let's talk about, all right, we've got an idea of what web components are. We got an idea of these REST controllers that will accept gets, posts, puts, process the information and send stuff back to you, response back to you. Okay, so how do we start thinking about portlets and what they do? So portlets have a configuration that's fairly rich, and they are going to respond to action URLs and render URLs from the front front end from the page, process those through a controller most often, and then send back a response, which ends up with into some kind of chunk of HTML that gets rendered on a page. Like when those happen, we're doing full page refreshes, and this is one of the reasons to move away from portlets as opposed to a chunk of the page getting refreshed. Really, that technology wants to see a whole page request come in and the whole page get replaced in your browser. So when we think about that technology and move, that's kind of secondary. Really, we want to talk about a higher level of what's the purpose of the portlet. So we have several of them. We have notifications. The purpose of the notifications portlet and that set of collection is we want to be able to grab information from backend services with the knowledge of who the user is that's making the request to give them back a custom, personalized notifications. We don't want to announce, hey, there's a broken sprinkler out by parking lot A or something. We want to tell them you have an outstanding charge, or you have a book that's overdue at the library. You've been accepted into, or you've received this amount of financial aid. So that's what notifications does. That's different from announcements. Announcements is more general. It'll focus on a group, but it's not targeted to a specific individual like notifications. It also adds a back end where you can have someone author, a different person approve an announcement. And of course, the admins who can manage the different topics. So very different structures to very similar problems. But any particular portlet needs to be analyzed to figure out what is it delivering. And then we talk about what are the resources. In the example of notifications, it is specifically notifications. There's really not much more to that. And announcements, because it's a richer interface within the portal, resources include the announcements, topics, they collect the announcements, who the authors are versus who the publishers are. And then I forget the title. There's like one or two other roles that can manage a workflow. It's inside of the announcements portlet that doesn't exist in notifications or anyplace else. And then these features, we want to talk about, besides the CRUD features of these different resources, what is it that's key about a particular portlet that makes it special, worthwhile, and useful? We need to make sure we have a list of those as we move forward. Again, with announcements, probably the more important part of that is that it allows a workflow and multiple people to go through to manage communications to your end users in the portal, where notifications are just information from a backend service that's very much targeting a particular person. Okay, does that make sense? So on top of having that higher level understanding, we kind of have three boundaries we need to consider as we start planning out a replacement of a portlet. There's the front end, and that's mostly collected in JSPs. I don't think too many of our portlets have built-in web components or more than dependencies on JavaScript libraries. But in there, you're going to find your HTML, CSS, and some JavaScript, pretty old and nasty JavaScript. And another thing that's important to track down are the links and the form posts. The reason why is that's really the interface between the front end and the back end. That's where we're going to have to figure out if we create our back end and we replace it with something more modern, all these links and posts will probably have to be adjusted. So that's an important collection of information for existing portlet. Then on the back end, they're all Java. Everything that we really need to change exists potentially in just the portlet controllers. Of course, we want to review the service classes and DAOs and the other things that a particular portlet does. But we really want to focus on the portlet controllers, what are the requests that it can process and what are the responses it's sending back? Okay. And kind of the last thing that's really a big concern, at least for me, because there's not much attention paid to it, is what's the configuration look like? So if for a portlet, configuration exists in a portlet XML file that is in the portlet WAR file itself. There's portlet definitions in the portlet admin UI where we can tweak the preferences inside of the portal. So it kind of overlays some of the preferences and other configuration information in portlet XML. And then on top of that, an individual, there's like the config mode and edit modes of portlets where additional configuration can happen. Configuration is more like the entire portlet, where edit is more particular users. We don't use that too much, but it's like one of the features for a user to set up their particular RSS feeds in the newsreader as opposed to a portal-wide configuration of a specific instance of newsreader. Okay. So I've underlined the important ones, which is links and form posts from the front end, the portlet controllers that respond to those on the back end, and then configuration in its entirety. So we can kind of do this in two steps when we actually get down past the planning and start making code changes. Refactoring a portlet controller to a servlet controller, it's super easy because the portlet controllers in Spring use annotations and classes that are actually sitting on top of servlet controller um, classes and features. So it's kind of a subset, and so it should be easy to walk that back into just a servlet controller. So if we don't even worry about trying to create RESTful APIs and we just really want to convert it into a servlet that mirrors the portlet controller, that work is usually straightforward. Right. But when we do want to take it to the next step and say, okay, this is still something useful that we want to make sure it's flexible enough for more interesting web controllers to talk to, then we'll want to go to the next step and make it a real API, at least a resource API. And then we start looking at refactoring. Again, Spring has a lot of support for a REST controller, a lot of annotations, and they come very close to what you can do with the portlet controllers and servlet controllers. However, you're really most likely going to have to rethink what that interface looks like. What are you going to expose as those HTTP verbs to come into this particular project, right? Another thing is because we're talking stateless, some of the logic and session information or workflow information is going to be moved over into the web components, and the backend becomes a little, dare I say, dumber, where we just don't have to worry about state nearly as much. A lot of that will be carried around with the information and during the requests about like user information. So on the front end, this is going to take more work, right? First of all, there's some really old cruddy stuff in some of these JSPs. But first thing we get to leverage the shadow DOM. So there was a lot of coding and adjustments and wrapping of libraries in the JavaScript area that we just don't have to deal with anymore. So we can just leverage the shadow DOM in that regard. Also, JavaScript has really moved forward, and a lot of things that the libraries did in the past, such as templating, it's just built in now, and we can certainly drop a handful of JavaScript libraries that helped in that regard. I'm thinking some of the uses of mustache and some of these other things that probably are a decade out of use now. So that's going to help as well. So JSPs are mapped to state and web components. And this is kind of a part of the conversation we had yesterday around what would a new front end look like. And we do have some folks who've done front ends where it's just one giant web component with big chunks of web component, breaking that down, and then having even more refined web components to deliver functionality and feature sets in small chunks. And that's how we ended up with our grid component that we use so heavily in some of the others. Right. Kind of going into the forms and actions links. This is probably going to be the biggest refactor, and that is figuring out how do we now go from where we had an assumed state was held on the server, and now we're going to move that state into the front end, and we're instead of going to make a simple request to kick off an operation, we're going to have to start tracking like how are we interacting with these RESTful APIs to get the same work done. Luckily, most of our portlets are really simple and we don't have a lot of workflow built into them. And so this becomes a challenge, but it's certainly not insurmountable. And finally, we get into configuration, right? So the portlet XML file defines some preferences and metadata. Usually most of the metadata isn't a concern. It's about what the code is expecting to have configured. So portlet XML defines preferences that can then be set up and defined in portlet definition data files in uPortal. But there's a few that aren't surfaced and aren't seen. So those files still need to be kind of analyzed before we get into the portlet definitions. But then once we have done that, we look at portlet definitions, other than a couple of attributes that are specific to uPortal, a lot of the preferences are just specific pre-populated values of preferences. And so we don't have to dig too deep, spend too much more time looking at definitions. So when we talk about what are the uPortal configuration values, we're talking about things like what type of Chrome. So that's something that the portal cares about, not the portlet rendering. So it's not something we need to worry about when we're talking about refining web components. They just shouldn't care about the Chrome that's being used to render them or wrap them. And then the last one is config and edit mode. Some of these portlets do have support for those modes. We really want to have those either set up as their own sort of internal state and like a better word, a page within the web component for a user to set up their preferences and values and store it in their browser or maybe on the back end, but as a separate step versus something that's happening supported directly by the portal. So that's just a lot of stuff thrown at you, but these are some of the things I've been thinking about when we talk about does it look like to go from a portlet to a web component. There's several things going on. All right, so I actually did run through that pretty fast, and I'm expecting there's some questions, or I've just thrown so much at you folks that there aren't any questions. Um, Let me resume sharing. Okay. Well, I don't hear any questions. I'm not sure if it's because of my audio. There aren't any questions at all.
Let's go through the example first, and then we'll see maybe questions will pop up. Let's see the example. Thanks.
Okay. Sounds good. So we'll take up, yeah, definitely some time here. So give me a second to set up. I'm going to stop sharing. All right. All right, folks, you should be seeing notifications portlet on GitHub. Okay. So this is the original repo that was notifications portlet, and of course it's been modified at least twice, refactored twice. One time was the initial breaking up of this into web components and an API backend, and then the web components were extracted into a separate project that we'll take a glance at. So here's some information here still about how to set it up. I won't go too long into this, but there's some information of what the API looks like. All right, so this is the new piece that was added. It's really a resource API because there's no links here. Right, and this is how you use the web components. Right, you need to use Vue. This documentation needs to be updated because you don't want to use a specific version. And you bring it in with the key part is this piece right here. We have 4 notification web components, and we'll talk about those and how to configure them. All right, but looking at the project, scrolling up here real quick, sorry about that. Here's your web app. We drill in here, source main web apps. This is a similar structure across most our portlets. We can go to web info, and here is our portlet XML. So you can see that we still are defining a notifications portlet. Here's all the preferences. You can see when we're doing the refactor, we need to pay attention to things like, what does this locations mean? What do these URLs mean? Here's the emergency alert. So that's part of the notifications. This is a little portlet that just lets you toggle it on and off for testing. The notifications icon, again, this is the old portlet notifications icon that used to sit in the top right corner for uPortal 4. And have preferences like how many things to list in the dropdown. Right. And so those are still in here. So we'll navigate over here to actual JavaScript. If you glance through this list here, you see, services and filters. A lot of this stuff will remain and won't necessarily have to be modified. This has been modernized though. We don't usually have Spring Java code for configuration, but this particular portlet does. But if we go jump in here, right, to our front end, our controllers, let's see what we have here. So we start seeing some annotations about this being a view. All right, so resource mapping, resource attributes. This is kind of like a, look over here back in the imports. I'm sorry, I'm all over the place. Bear with me here. So this was that resource mapping, and you can see right in the name of the import, it's portlets. So the event mapping and action mapping. All right, so this is a little different from where this would potentially be stuff that would refactor from an action, and this correlates with portlet action URLs and portlet render URLs. So this one's an action mapping, expecting some information as a post or a form submission. Right, so this is we have events as well. That's something also that's part of the API, but it's really backend and it shouldn't have been tied up to controllers like this, and we've had some challenges here, so that should all be moved further back into the services and not at a controller level. So this is what we would start with. In this particular case, a new folder was created called REST, and there was one originally, just an initial effort. It hadn't been touched in a while, but here's where we end up. So if you look at the annotations now, we're no longer dealing with portlets. So we're kind of handling request mappings, and there is the REST controller annotation that we're using. All right, so we just tag this and talk about what we're looking for. So this is the root of the API. All right, so if you're writing code to hit the notifications API, it'd be notifications slash API slash v2. Standard Spring annotations for auto wiring. And then we get in here and we do our notifications, and the method is we're using a get call. Right. And so we've really gone from kind of the higher level processing and requests in the portlet controller to a simplified resource RESTful API. So we do have to make sure we let the controller know, the methods know, or map them to the request methods, those verbs, and the URL. So it's pretty simple and straightforward, and I bet you if we went through, we could probably clean this up even further. But that's it. A lot of that work has been pushed over to the web components. Let's go look at the front end. So we're still looking at the web app. Now we're going to drive into source main resources. Oh, sorry. Web apps. Web info is where we usually keep our JSPs. And so let's look at a simple list. So here's some portlet action URLs getting defined and populated with some values, right? Using some tags and some other stuff that we don't have to worry about anymore. Resource aggregations. Here's this little thing we used to do to make sure that if you had multiple notification instances on your page, that there wasn't collision of JavaScript trying to run across multiple or all the other instances. This helps to isolate it. Again, a lot of this stuff kind of disappears. And that's not too bad. But we still need to do some of this weird jQuery stuff that, again, just disappears. Because all we're doing is listing the notification the user can access. All right, so let's look at something a little more interesting. Show alerts and styling with these kind of weird annotations at the front or prefixes, title bar, body, right? And then a bunch of this JavaScript. A lot of this can be cleaned up because it's older. Again, just stuff just to deal with the fact that you're on a page where you don't know what else is on there. Right. So if we go back to uPortal project, I'm going a little over time, but I just want to expose everyone to this. We'll go over here to notifications. We now have notifications web component. All right, so there is a README that kind of helps you with how to create the dependency inside of resource server, etc. And it tells you about the 4 different ones. Let's hop into the list. Oh, shucks, it doesn't even tell you about The important thing here is we do need to know where are we getting user information from. And this is OpenID Connect is what OIDC is referring to. And uPortal has this particular endpoint where a web component can hit that and get a JWT that has the user's information, such as attributes, group memberships, and a few other things. That can be configured as well. So even though this is kind of a well-known uPortal project, we're still making it go through the hoops now of grab the user information through this API. Don't rely on session information or anything like that with uPortal. Now that you've got this token, pass it to your servlet. And the servlet or the API needs to know that it's signed by uPortal because it could be coming from anywhere. And so there's some key processing or key sharing that needs to happen, but that's usually handled in the properties file. By moving right along, let's look at what some of this looks like. So let's look at a notification item. Now this has been enhanced. So the portlet JSP was pretty simple once you got past all the JavaScript, but it really didn't look that good. It was hard to work on. Here, we've got this web component. Here's our template, essentially the HTML we're going to mess with. We're using the Vue framework. So we get a couple things like we can do loop through items with this v-4, a couple other niceties. We do have a lot of things here that you need to understand Vue's approach to how they set up their web components to understand what goes into props versus computed and methods. So there's a little more refinement in here. And here's that get token OIDC. We actually made the OIDC fetching into its own standalone JavaScript library. So you just import it into your web component and then you can call it with the API and it should get you your token. So here we're fetching the data by using the token. Right. And so this is happening without a full page refresh. And then the second part, we're doing some stuff like when it's first brought, mounted onto the page, go ahead and do a couple things. So there's certainly some points within the life cycle that we have injected some customizations to make sure things are happening in the right order. And all the rest of this is styling. So is it more code? Definitely more code goes into the front end, right? But the back end gets much easier. And if you're going to be a developer doing front and back end development, it's much nicer to have your back end that requires minutes to restart happen a lot less frequently than your front end that just takes a page refresh after you've made some code changes. And so here, a nice way of isolation again, the notifications list, this is a notifications list item. So here's the template again, doing some nice stuff here, and it looks a lot better. It's more functional. Our imports, our JavaScript and Vue type things, right? And then our styling. So it compartmentalizes things quite well, but it does require a broader skill set if you're going to be doing both front end and back end. So this is much more robust in the sense that when we get to the portlet definition, which is what we want to change later, we can actually just drop in a custom HTML tag, and that represents all this code and styling and HTML. Anyway, I'm over time, so if you have any questions, I'll take one or two now, but we can certainly discuss this more on the mailing list. We're going to be putting these sessions out, probably YouTube or some other way so that folks in the community can look them over. And really, these are kick off topics and discussions for us to continue dialogue in our mailing lists and Slack so that we can move this project forward in a way that we all want to see it grow and that will support our needs for our communities. Okay, so any questions?